Welcome back to Professor M's History Hub. Today we're diving into one of the most sweeping transformations in human history, the integration of the Americas and Oceania with the wider world starting in 1492 and unfolding over centuries. From empires toppling to cultures colliding, from sugar plantations to silver mines, the early modern era was nothing short of revolutionary for this side of the globe. Let's get ready to track the people, politics, profits, and power that shaped the New World. Let's get started. After Columbus's first voyage in 1492, Europeans didn't just stumble across new land, they launched a global chain reaction. The Americas and Oceania, previously isolated from Afro-Eurasian contact, suddenly found themselves pulled into a whirlwind of biological, technological, and cultural exchange. Europeans brought horses, iron tools, and firearms, but they also brought diseases like smallpox and measles, to which indigenous populations had zero immunity. Mortality rates soared, wiping out entire communities before battles even began. This was the Columbian Exchange, and for the Americas, it was often lethal. Now let's zoom into the Caribbean, where the Taino people dominated the islands when Columbus arrived. They lived in villages, governed by chiefs, grew manioc, and had a rich, complex society. But then came the encomienda system, a Spanish colonial labor arrangement that promised to protect and Christianize indigenous people in exchange for their labor. In practice, it was a license to enslave. This system broke the Taino. Resistance was met with brutal violence. They had no real defense against steel weapons or smallpox. By the 1540s, most Tainos were gone, but their cultural traces remain. Ever hear the words canoe, hurricane, or barbecue? These are all Taino words. By the mid-1500s, the Caribbean was out of gold, so European attention shifted to sugar and tobacco plantations. Labor shortages were solved by importing millions of enslaved Africans, turning the Caribbean into the first major hub of the Atlantic slave trade. As the Caribbean faded in economic importance, the Spanish looked to the American mainland. Enter the conquistadores, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, who combined audacity with firepower. These weren't random raids. The Spanish took down powerful empires, the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru, not just with swords, but with alliances, strategy, and above all, epidemics that softened resistance. In 1519, Cortés marched into the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, aided by a remarkable figure, La Malinche, a Nahua noblewoman who became his translator and partner. Their child, Martín, is considered the first mestizo, a symbol of the blending and breaking of worlds. Cortés allied with rival tribes, kidnapped Emperor Moctezuma II, and by 1521, the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan was reduced to rubble. In Peru, Pizarro struck during a civil war between Inca brothers. By 1533, he had tricked, ransomed, and executed Atahualpa, and looted the city of Cusco. As with Cortés, local resentment and European germs did half the work. By the 1570s, the Spanish crown reasserted control. They created two viceroyalties, New Spain in modern-day Mexico and New Castile in today's Peru, each ruled by a viceroy but monitored by audiencias, colonial courts. In 1542, Charles V issued the new laws of the Indies banning Indian enslavement, but enforcement was spotty. Thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, Portugal got Brazil. At first they shrugged, but once sugar prospects boomed, Portuguese entrepreneurs swarmed the coast, establishing a plantation economy that would depend heavily on enslaved Africans. Colonial cities in both empires became outposts of European life. Spanish-style architecture, Catholic cathedrals, and European customs dominated cities. But beyond the city walls, indigenous traditions persisted. Languages, agriculture, clothing all survived in rural zones. Some mestizos, like El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who had adopted Spanish language and customs, provided rich histories of indigenous societies for European audiences. While many conquistadores and missionaries generally mistreated and abused indigenous populations, two Dominican friars stood out. Bartolomé de las Casas, whose short account of the destruction of the Indies provided a searing indictment of Spanish brutality, and Francisco de Vitoria, who argued in 1532 that indigenous peoples had legal rights, including freedom of religion, ideas foundational to modern international law. By the early 1600s, the Spanish had a head start in the Americas, but their grip was loosening in the north. French, English, and Dutch mariners began carving out their own footholds. The French founded colonies at Port Royal, Nova Scotia in 1604 and Quebec in 1608. They explored deep into the St. Lawrence, Ohio, and Mississippi River systems, setting up forts and creating an expansive web of trade routes that stretched from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. The first attempt at establishing a permanent English settlement was in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. But this early attempt failed as a result of high mortality rates due to starvation and disease, a period known as the Starving Time. Later, the English were more successful in establishing permanent colonies in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the Dutch built New Amsterdam in 1623, only to lose it to the English in 1644, who renamed it New York. Early settlers depended heavily on indigenous help just to survive, especially in harsh winters. As more settlers arrived, some 150,000 English migrants in the 1600s alone, conflict escalated. Europeans saw the land as unused because indigenous groups practiced seasonal migration and hunting, not settled farming. This justified seizure of territory and violent displacement of native populations. Epidemics did the rest. War, disease, and land grabs ravaged indigenous communities. European settlement was not just migration, it was colonization, often at gunpoint. Native resistance occurred, but was frequently crushed, and entire cultures vanished within a century. No European empire remained pure, especially in Spanish and Portuguese territories where male settlers were the majority and interactions with indigenous and African women were common. This gave rise to mestizo societies, ethnically blended, culturally layered, and often unstable in terms of social hierarchy. To impose order, Spanish authorities created a caste-based racial hierarchy shown in elaborate casta paintings. Think of them as colonial flowcharts for race and status. These paintings tried to define 16 combinations of mixed races, each with different rights. But colonial life resisted simple labels. The system was confusing, constantly shifting, and ultimately reduced to 7 main racial categories: peninsulares, European-born whites; criollos, American-born whites; mestizos, those of Spanish and indigenous mix; mulattoes, a mixture of white European and black African identities; zambos, those with a mixture of Indian and African blood; indios, purely indigenous people; and Negroes, people of African descent. Gender roles also played a role. Male privilege dominated. The availability of women shaped not just family life, but entire social structures. While Spanish and Portuguese colonists often integrated racially, English and French settlers followed different paths. The French, especially fur traders, formed alliances and families with indigenous communities, giving rise to the métis, or mixed-race children who often served as cultural intermediaries. English settlers, by contrast, tended to see indigenous people as either obstacles or inferiors. They intermarried less frequently, but borrowed heavily from native practices, especially in agriculture and frontier survival. Forget gold. Silver was the real treasure. The Zacatecas region in Mexico and the Potosí mines in Bolivia became centers of global wealth extraction. To keep the mines running, the Spanish revived the Inca mita system, requiring each village to send 1/7 of its men to do 4 months of mining labor per year, a dangerous and often deadly job. Spanish crown claimed a quinto, or 1/5 of all silver, enriching royal coffers. Much of the silver made its way across the Pacific via the Manila galleons, linking the Americas with Asia, particularly China, where silver was in high demand. Mining also stimulated local economies. Towns grew around mining centers, and estates called haciendas produced food, tools, and animals to support them, helping to create a complex colonial economy. In Brazil, sugar was king. The ingenio, or sugar mill, was not just a factory. It was a self-contained industrial plantation complex combining land, labor, animals, tools, and skilled knowledge. Portuguese plantation owners wielded massive power, but operated on thin profit margins. They leaned heavily on enslaved African labor beginning in earnest in the 1580s. Because indigenous populations resisted and succumbed to disease, enslaved Africans became the primary workforce. Conditions were hellish. Mortality outpaced birth rates, so owners didn't try to foster families. They simply bought more people. It's estimated that one human life was lost for every ton of sugar produced in Brazil. That statistic alone should haunt us. North American colonization began with the fishing industry, but it was the fur trade, especially for beaver pelts, that took off. Indigenous people trapped animals and traded pelts for European goods, such as metal tools, guns, and cloth. French and Dutch traders built networks of forts and trading posts, integrating deeply with native communities. But competition turned violent. Beaver populations declined, and tribes encroached on each other's land, sparking wars. Meanwhile, European farmers began pushing west, transforming hunting grounds into plantations and towns. In Virginia and the Carolinas, colonists shifted to cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo, all demanding cheap labor. They initially relied on indentured servants, mostly poor young Englishmen who worked 4 to 7 years in exchange for Atlantic passage and a plot of land once their contract was over. But by the mid-1600s, enslaved Africans began replacing indentured servants. The first group arrived in Virginia in 1619. Unlike indenture, chattel slavery was for life and inherited. Every colony, whether north or south, profited from the slave trade, no exception. In Mexico and Peru, Catholic missionaries sought to convert indigenous populations. While some embraced Christianity, many blended it with their own beliefs, creating religious syncretism. Take, for example, the Virgin of Guadalupe, said to have appeared near Mexico City in 1541. She became a uniquely Mexican symbol, a fusion of Catholic and indigenous spirituality. French Jesuits, who were more respectful of indigenous beliefs and customs, were more effective in converting tribes than any other European group. English Protestants, however, showed little interest in conversions. Their missions were sporadic, often overshadowed by land hunger and settler expansion. European maps long speculated about a southern land that they called Terra Australis Incognita. Dutch sailors first spotted Australia in 1606, but it wasn't until James Cook charted the East Coast in 1770 that interest spiked. In 1788, Britain sent a fleet of convicts to Botany Bay, launching the colonization of Australia as a penal colony. Only in the 1830s did free settlers begin to outnumber prisoners. Magellan passed through the Pacific in 1521, but it wasn't until Cook's explorations in the 1770s that European interest surged. Islands like Guam and the Marianas became waypoints on the Spanish route between Mexico and the Philippines. By the early 1800s, Europeans were trading, exploring, and colonizing across the Pacific. Much of this interest had to do with the popularity of Captain James Cook's writings on his exploits in the Pacific. But the great British explorer's adventures came to an end in 1779 when he was killed by native warriors in the Hawaiian Islands. And that, my friends, is how the Americas and Oceania were swept into the great currents of global change. Conquest, colonization, conversion, and commerce. Each left scars and legacies still visible today. In our next episode, we'll examine how these systems gave rise to revolutions, resistance, and new nations. Until then, keep asking questions and remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to learn from it.